Welcome to this session on climate change in the framework of this workshop. We will have a presentation and we will give Pablo Ruiz 30 minutes. You're all familiar with him. Pablo is the architect of this workshop and he's a professor of economics at the postgraduate school of economics at the UNAM, and he also has a long career at the UNAM. After his presentation, we will have comments from two panelists by Geoffrey Hewings from Real, the University of Illinois of Urbana at Champaign, and second we will have Faye Duchin from the Renssalaer Polytechnic, the Renssalaer Polytechnical Institute. Where is it? Sorry, in New York. So they will both get 15 minutes each, and Pablo, please. Well, 25. Yep. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all our all the people visiting from abroad for coming all the way here. We also want to thank the INEGI for its support, and my two panelists and my moderator. Professor Jaime Ros is an emeritus professor at the University of Notre Dame, and it's an honor for me to be sitting next to him and having him introduce me. What can I say about Geoffrey Hewings and Dr. Faye Duchin? As has been said before, they are ex-presidents of the International Association for Input-Output Analysis. The issue of technology or technological change and emissions has a history behind it. I did work for the Ministry of National Resources and the Environment in Mexico in 2008, because that year we finally had access to the 2003 matrix, which after a 23-year lag, it takes a bit to do things in Mexico, but they're done right when they're finally done. So I took advantage of this situation and I began studying climate change. I was hired by the Ministry of National Resources and the Environment. The person who hired me is Roberto Cabral. He's here today. He was the Deputy Director of Financial Resources of the Semarnat, which is this ministry. That's why I invited him, to show him that we've been doing things ever since. What happened to this piece of work is that what happens in many places, it was even though it was published by the Semarnat, nobody read it, but nobody's a prophet in his own land. It was in Spanish, but the people who read it were the French. And one day I was just sitting around and I received a phone call from a French person from the French Agency for Development, and he said, "Oh, you wrote this paper? Oh, that's great. I invite you to Paris. First class tickets, hotel included." So I said, "Oh, of course I can't. That goes against my principles." I said, and he's like, "No, it's not what you're thinking. I'll pass you to my boss." So I spoke to her, And she's like, oh no, this is serious. We're truly going to invite you because we want you to give us your opinion on what can be done to help Mexico. There's funds from the French Development Agency, and they're managed by the UN, and we're truly inviting you to. And yes, I traveled to Paris in first class, my first time on first class, probably the last. But we were there at the French Agency for Development. I met with the director of the agency, and he kindly, and contrary to many French people, said, oh, there was a series of people invited, and he said, oh, if you don't speak French, I don't. Even though my wife is French, he said, oh, don't worry, we can discuss this in English. And the first question was hard. It was tough. He said, okay, your president was at Copenhagen at the COP 2010, climate change. And yes, presidents love to travel at the expense of taxpayers, but what did he do? Well, he committed to reducing emissions of Mexico in 30%. And like, yes? Oh, wow. Well, surely he's going to do it then. And but my question is, how is he going to do this? Well, that's what the person from France asked, and I said, I'm not really sure. Maybe ask his advisors. No, we want to hire you to do a project on what should be done to reduce emissions of GHG gases in Mexico. Well, technology changes, that's what we need to do. We're like, okay, we'll write it on the paper and we'll see you in May in Mexico. And we met in Mexico, and I developed a project. They agreed with it. We signed the protocol, and well, that's what we did. And I was assigned not an observer, but a supervisor who was very strict, Dr. Terry Barker, who's sitting in the back. And supervision was very strict. Hopefully I passed Terry, but well, that's how we reached this article, which I'm going to present now. And this is a short version of the paper because the paper was very long. We had the participation of many people, including two of the people who presented today, Dr. Martín Puchet Anjul and Valentin Solis, who were kind enough to give me their advice, and some of my helpers as well, my aides. It was a large project, and hopefully it worked out well. What's it about? It's about knowing what the requirements or conditions are for Mexico to reduce its GHG emissions, its greenhouse gas emissions, in an input-output model. So the first issue is determining what the current emissions are and see what the tendency is, just the way it is right now. And we used a model for this. We called it an environmental model for input-output, or an ecologic model. But to reach this specific level, we had to determine the size of the problem, detect the sectors that emit these gases, and the classification of national accounts of the economic sector does not correspond with the classification of the government agencies or the entities responsible of measuring emissions. So that was the first problem we had to solve. Once we made steps forward in this direction, we were able to identify the sectors of the economy that created the most emissions by unit of production, or those who produce most in absolute terms. So we had a series of branches that we were able to identify. The Mexico matrix, which we initially used, was for 2003, but we made certain adjustments and a forecast for the 2008 one, and that's how we were able to understand more of the information on emissions. So we were able, through a matrix classification, to identify the most emitting sectors, and we were also seeking to define the strategic sectors of the Mexican economy for the year 2008. So we began having problems at this point because there's several definitions of what a key sector is. There are some indicators, such as those by Rasmussen, others by Eric Diessenbachen, who was not here. He was going to attend, but finally he couldn't. And there's some even older ones, Kenry Watanabe. So we decided to test two of them. Those by Rasmussen and Dietzenbacher. And at the end, we brought both groups together, the strategic sectors and the most polluting sectors, and we looked for the intersection. That's what we did. To detect the sectors that should be attended to by a serious policy that forces a reduction in emissions. The idea is that if we attack the key sectors that are highly polluting, we will reduce general pollution and the general emission of greenhouse gases.
There's a couple of important observations there. We're not referring to the emissions of gases that are produced by the consumers. We don't touch on that. We don't have elements. There are no demand functions that can be estimated by sector or by institutional sector. So we don't include that. We're only looking at the aspect that has to do with the supply, the production, and the transport of output transport. That's where we attack the issue. And of course, it's not the full pollution, the full gas emission. It has been very clearly defined by productive sectors. And there was a little bit of a confusion in the classification, an agreement to the matrix classification, but we managed to do this, and it has already been produced. So these were the Rasmussen coefficients that we used, and Rasmussen coefficients. According to the Rasmussen method, these are the indicators with a greater link or chaining, both upstream and downstream, organized by their degree of importance. To the left, you can see the backward linkages, and to the right, you can see the forward linkage. All right. So these are the 23 most important out of the 79. Then we use the Dissenbacher extraction method, and we did the same, and we defined a set with the 23 different sectors, different industries, and we created this set of sectors of industries. So then we went into looking at the emitters, the most important emitters. We have the electric power industry. You can see that the most important one in absolute terms. And then obviously we have the truck transportation sector. In the third place, we have forestry and logging. And there's a whole series of activities that follow. The most of them, the most important aspect is a very reduced group of sectors. Then we estimated the emission coefficient by output unit, and the highest emitter in relative terms was the remedial services and the trash burning. And then we also have forestry and logging and so on and so forth. Remediation services. So here we identified two different groups, key sectors and highly pollutant sectors. In the intersection of these two groups, there are three subsets. In the first group, in order of importance, there are four industrial branches or industrial sectors that are highly strategic in nature because of their level of linkage and highly pollutant because of their absolute and relative emissions. Electricity, iron and steel, petroleum or oil, and coal products, and truck transportation. Finally, truck transportation. It seems convenient to include within this group another industry, another industrial branch, which is oil and gas, that produces high greenhouse gas emissions as a producer, and also has important forward linkages, but less important backward linkages. Within the second group, there are two industries. Forestry, one of the highest GHG emitters, with a low level of inter-industrial connection, as well as mining, which appears second place in all the groups. Mining is a group that contains 7 different industries or industrial branches that could be defined as the strategic pollutant sector. On a second level of importance, the 5 industrial branches that are associated to transport: air transportation, railway transportation, water transportation, ground transportation, and tourist or scenic transportation. All these branches altogether, these 12 industries as a whole, are undoubtedly the most relevant to deal with for purposes of emission mitigation. We developed a model in order to project where we're moving towards, where Mexico is moving forward to, under 2 different assumptions. Well, they're called the trend is called business as usual, actually. This has 2 assumptions. One is a growth that the government said that we claimed we would be having, and we never had, of 3.5% growth per year, which never took place. And another is the mid-trend. Let's assume that the GDP per capita does not grow, and we only grow half of this, which is 1.7, which is the population growth, actually. So what happens with the gas emissions in our model? Here is the model. As opposed to Valentino, I will go into the technical details. I hope that I am sure that you're going to be hitting me on the head in a while. The idea is to introduce a second set of possible scenarios. What would happen if we make a technological change? This is where we face certain issues. We were unable to do what other researchers did, specifically speaking, some practically personal friends. I say practically because I fed them up with emails that we became friends, although I've only seen one in person, actually. The other one I don't even know personally. But they created a very nice model of the same kind of environmental model, but they had access to ways of substituting technologies for different reasons. The work is Animat Innenberg and Kojan Brink, the two people from Netherlands, and their work was presented in 2007, and it was also presented in one of the International Output Association conferences. The fact is I didn't have that access to that information, and since the deadline was around the corner and the French people were a little bit nervous and they wanted to see results, and I couldn't find the technologies that I was looking for, I resorted to Plan B. Plan B was to borrow technologies from other countries, technologies that had been successful in other countries. And I found that Canada had reduced emissions from being a high-emitting country. It had managed to reduce its emissions. And not only that, but they had reverted the trend. They now had a good level of GHG gases, specifically in forestry. So, from that economy, we took 6 different vectors and we introduced them into our input-output matrix as they were. And emissions were reduced. We ran it and the emissions were reduced. And that was the result that we got. The trajectories we won't be able to see easily. That's why we decided to create a graph. This is a graph when nothing happens. The white line is moving towards 3.5% by 2020, and the red line is growing towards at a 1.7% towards 2020. As you can see, emissions are reduced significantly by 2020. We're never reaching what President Calderon promised of a 30% reduction by 2008, but the trend is reduced, it is lowered. However, the cost of this is not to grow. That is a cost to pay. Now, as my friend Jaime Ross said, what happens if we become Canadians from one day to the other? Well, this would happen, as you can see in this graph. The first year, the emissions drop notoriously, but later on we recover the trend, the increasing trend. The green line shows the trend with a growth rate of 3.5%, and the orange line is the one that shows, with technological change, a GDP growth at 1.7%. I won't go into the changes by sector because it's very lengthy, but what I can say is that technological change has a double virtue. On the one hand, it reduces emissions, not as the former President Calderon would have liked, but it does reduce emissions, and at the same time, there's a greater growth as what had been foreseen. The blue line is showing the trend with technological change of output growth, not of emissions, but of output, whereas the green line shows the output growth under conditions of low economic growth. Conclusions. Apart from this, I had to read a lot of literature. I read even Nordhaus, and what's his name? Of course, Terry Barker, Stern. I read a lot of this discussion, and what I discovered was that in the end, yes, technological change does produce a reduction in emissions, but for there really be a GHG emission drop, there has to be a very large technological change. We did this exercise, the simulation exercise, with 6 different branches. If we did something, a more serious work and a deeper work, I am sure that we would be able to, if not reach the goal that the former president committed us to, we could at least reduce the emission levels. But this would imply a state decision, and not a market decision, a decision taken by the state. Strong policies. In Canada, the reforestry policy was very strong. It wasn't incentives. It was a sanction-based policy. Either you reforest, I'm overdoing it, or you pay double. There's no other way. These are serious policies. The other policies, the market policies, have been taking place for more than 18 years, and they haven't seen any results. Pollution hasn't been reduced. The tons of GHG gases have not been reduced at all. And there have been important efforts. But it all has been because of incentives, market-oriented incentives. Behave yourself, stop emitting. That's my conclusion. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pablo. And I will give the floor to the first commentator, Geoffrey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Pablo, for a nice presentation. I think my colleague, Faye Duchin, is probably more appropriate to talk about the niceties of the model. I'm going to take a sort of a 10,000-meter view of this paper, and I really hope that Terry Barker will weigh in on this, because this is something that he has worked in quite extensively. I think that what we've heard from the presentation today from Pablo is very, very symptomatic of a growing trend amongst the input-output community. In the last 2 or 3 conferences, well over 1/3, in some cases over 50% of the papers have been looking at the link between the economy and the environment. And it is clear that there are a number of options, and what Pablo has presented is one of many. And the things that I think that we are struggling with are trying to understand the impact of growth and development on the environment. We're trying to understand what the true costs of mitigation are. Most importantly, trying to understand the trade-offs between addressing environmental issues and addressing economic growth and development issues. And those who have worked in the CGE environment have drawn our attention to some of the problems of what they refer to as rebound effects, that we reduce in this part of the economy, but suddenly there's an increase in consumption, which generates increased greenhouse gas emissions in another part of the economy. So handling the economy-wide effects is really very, very, very critical. And the final issue is the degree to which we want to address the problem at the source of production or at the source of consumption. And there's a huge literature on that I won't say very much about. As I read the paper, I was thinking about my colleagues at the University of Illinois in the 1970s who did a lot of interesting, innovative work on environmental economic modeling using mixed units. And I've always been concerned why we haven't gone back to this and thought about it, because we're always struggling with our units in this type of work. So perhaps this is an opportunity we might want to think in these terms. The other part of this I thought in your section 2, how you link the IO model with the greenhouse gas emissions categories was valuable enough that I would like to have seen it. And in particular, the degree to which you evaluated any sensitivity analysis to the allocation choices that were made and what impacts they had on the scenario developments that you looked at later. Table 3, I wasn't quite sure whether you were dealing only with direct emissions or total emissions. And that is the emissions that were embodied in the value chain, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The key sector analysis, I think, provides us with some good understanding about how the Mexican economy works, but I think we need to consider those sectors that are not only direct polluters, as opposed to generate pollution through that value chain. And that's what I would like to see a little bit more of. And a good example of this was waste and water treatment, one of the high polluters, but it's a mitigation sector. And somehow I felt we were not treating that as equitably as perhaps we would the electric power generation capacity. The product mix issue is another one that I have struggled with in our work. And I'm wondering perhaps as you extend this work, you can perhaps address that. For example, electrical generation can often involve very, very different types of processes. And so what options does Mexico have to think about less reliance on thermal energy, on natural gas, and more on renewables, and on solar, on biomass? In other words, when I turn on the light, I hope that the light will go on, and I'm not really aware of how that electricity is produced, but from an environmental point of view, it's very important. So each of these will have a different contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, both directly and indirectly. And again, this is where we are often faced with an issue: how do we handle the problems of prices? And in environmental policy, for example, does Mexico have a renewal portfolio standard that producers have to address? So I think the comment I've made a couple of times is I'd like to see a little bit more insights into this pollution chain, the value chain, and how it's working. As you looked at putting together the EIO model, you had a number of choices, and I like that discussion. I think you might benefit from looking at my colleagues' early work, particularly on the dynamic versions of the model, and of course some of Terry Barker's recent work. And I'm also wondering about, occasionally there was a sort of a hint about optimization. And in particular, as your goal is to reduce, I think in one part of the paper you said the gas emissions to 30% below it should be the 2002 levels, not 2020 levels, by 2030. I'm not quite sure how the optimization entered into your particular model. And in particular, I think it's important to consider both technological change and change in demand or variety at one and the same time. And we did something like this for the Midwest of the US, in which we used a continuous time version of our econometric input-output model, where we looked at the production effects, in other words, effects generated by demand, and the technological effects. And what we were able to do then is to look over time as to how the pollution was changing and what contribution was coming from technology and what contribution was coming from changes in demand. And I think, as we heard earlier this morning from the value chain analysis, there are all sorts of interesting issues here about as Mexico becomes much more involved in value chains that are globally in context, what does that do to pollution? So there's a sort of a further strategy that you might want to figure. So what we ended up was a typology of outcomes that looked something like this. And without going into detail, you had cases where some sectors were dominated by production effects, others were dominated by technology effects. So I'm also a little concerned about whether the IO model alone might be the most suitable. And I put here before I had remembered that Terry was coming to the meeting. So apologies, Terry. I'm commenting on your evaluation, so I will just say that you have criticized CGE models, but there's something about that trade-off issue that I'm wondering whether your approach is better, whether our econometric IO approach is better. So I'll let him make that comment. And I think the gauche alternative provides some attractions, but we're still dealing with a partial equilibrium. And the question is, how do we deal with a realistic general equilibrium? And I think that's something that we need to discuss. So as we're looking at this, my final thoughts, should we be focusing on the source of production or the source of consumption? How much greenhouse gases are Mexico importing, embodied in goods and services, and how much are they exporting? And I think if we're going to do a full accounting, I think that might be appropriate. And the analogy is that what you're dealing is trade in volume as opposed to trade in value added. So I'm wondering whether we could think about the embodied part of this process. And I like the use of the Canadian data as an option. But again, as you allude, there are significant institutional differences, and we have to be a little cautious there. And finally, who pays for these changes? I was sort of interested. Are we talking about incentives, taxes, trading permits, things of this kind? What are the welfare implications? Who's going to suffer the most from this? Are the burdens going to be shared equally across all income groups? So I think that I see this paper as providing a huge investment, and I think there are some very, very exciting future work that you can do with this, and I look forward to hearing more. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Muchas gracias, Geoffrey.
Could we get my thing up?
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you for the introduction, and I want to thank Pablo for not only inviting me, but for inviting me to discuss his own paper. And it's been a real pleasure for me to begin to get to know some colleagues here, because the way Jeff Hewings, just as he said a little while ago, we live so close, and I've really not, over all these years, collaborated with Mexican colleagues, and I hope that this meeting provides an opportunity to have more exchanges. I noticed two things that stand out just in framing this meeting. And one of them is the fact that apparently there's a great deal of interest in input-output economics in Mexico today, and in particular among a younger generation who are just being trained. This is true in some other places also, and I think this is really necessary, not sufficient, but necessary in order to carry on this enterprise. But the other thing that I notice is the word and the spirit of political economy. Okay, and in my university, in my economics department, not a course on political economy, and to my taste, not enough of it in the International Input-Output Association. And I have the feeling that this is another kind of contribution that the more active Mexican participation in the organization can bring. And I think that the importance of political economy is really twofold. That first of all, it suggests the questions, the strategic questions we should be asking. I mean, what good are models and data if we don't have the questions right? And I think that the questions have to come out of a much broader consideration than the particular topic that one is looking at any particular time. And the second thing that political economy has to offer is theory. Centuries or generations of reflection on how economies do work, on how they could work. And I think that the three big issues that we've heard discussed here have to do with what are being called value chains. Perhaps I'll have a few moments to give some reflections on that, on globalization, and on sustainable, both development and sustainable development. And I think that from a political economy point of view, these are the issues of our times, and it behooves us to frame the questions right and to develop the theory that we still need, not to believe that it all exists already and we just have to find the right model, but rather to get the theoretical considerations right and to design the models or to change the models, to extend the models. They're not fixed in stone. We need models and data that can help us answer the questions that we want to address. So with that, I want to turn to this paper in particular. And what I really appreciated about this paper is how thorough and how systematic it is in laying out the different parts of research that needed to be done. And I understand from what you say that it was a big project. Nonetheless, I hope that it's part of an even bigger research program, okay, because there's a lot that remains to be said. And I would say that the paper's got 5 components. Identifying strategic sectors, which we've heard about. Defining scenarios. We've heard a little about that too. These are scenarios about technological change. Choosing models. Obtaining data. And coming to conclusions. And of all the conclusions, the ones that I've found most compelling are that there's no way in what you consider to be optimistic assumptions that the commitments can be met. Okay, well, that in itself says it all. This is not the end of this study. Okay, and so the question is, well, then what next? What might be some ways that make sense from a lot of points of view, not only this point of view, to follow up. And so what I'd like to do in the few minutes that I have left is to go through each of these steps and to offer just a few ideas, because we really don't have time. This isn't the best format, I think, for a technical discussion. I would have made different decisions down the line, but those decisions were fine. They fit together. They gave you some conclusions, and perhaps at some other time we can discuss them in more detail. So I just want to make some observations about each of these steps. And so the first one is you talk about strategic sectors. So we're talking about strategy. And I think that any contemplation of strategy for reducing environmental damage obviously has to be part of a development agenda and a development strategy, right? And there are a lot of ways to achieve any particular objective, and sometimes there are none, but of the different ways, one wants to be able to choose ways that make sense for different objectives. You identified the energy complex and forestry as being strategic sectors, but strategic for linkages, and I would say there are linkages and linkages, they're not all the same, right? But I was very interested that those two came out of the analysis, because it seems to me, from a development point of view also, that energy and forestry are key, because they are not only resource endowments, but Mexico has high-quality resource endowments there, and therefore the possibility to have a comparative advantage in the whole chain of production that starts from them. And so, that's a chain also, and that's got linkages, but these linkages can yield resource rents and not only ordinary type profits. So it seems to me they're really strategic. And of course, the Mexican sectors in both of those areas have specifically Mexican attributes. I mean, compared to Canada, where they're extracting oil from tar sands, you've certainly got a very different energy sector. And compared to their forests, I mean, you have a growing cycle that's so much faster, there's just no comparison. Okay, so those seem to me like really key areas. Of course, the domestic linkages that are most important for Mexico that, frankly, I haven't worked with that much because they're less important for, say, the United States or from in a certain way from a global point of view is the maquilas, which I heard mentioned here this morning, which I never heard mentioned, export-free zones, never heard them mentioned at an input-output meeting. And that's where the backward linkages are really important, but hopefully backward linkages that link into the strategic sectors, not ones that link into just low-cost labor. Okay, as for defining scenarios, one objective was to identify alternative technologies. But of course, one also is interested in investment in alternative investment options. And most of these technologies are going to require investment, and investment being part of final demand fits very well into such an analysis and really does need to be taken into account. I wouldn't jump to a dynamic analysis because that introduces so much complexity. I personally would stick for a while, okay? Linkages. So linkages from energy, from oil in particular, and from forestry, obvious ones are petrochemicals and a paper industry, and the idea being to keep more income in the country. And I think it's time to require a conceptual disaggregation of value added. I'm not convinced that value added is as important a conceptual category as it could be. And so value added is payments to labor, and it's payments to capital, but it's also rents and royalties on raw materials. It depends upon property rights. It depends upon ownership. And these are things that we've never really elucidated, but when you want to talk about developing these industries, it begins to be essential to, if there are not data, to estimate data, to see what that gives, to improve the estimates, but I think that they become really important. I think that evaluating trade-offs among multiple objectives is really important, so one could have an economic objective of reducing costs or of stimulating growth or whatever it might be, and then some environmental objectives, and when one can see the outcomes in both cases and look at the trade-offs. Somebody mentioned that before, and I think it's really important to look at the trade-offs between pursuing different kinds of objectives. And as I just said, evaluating payments to distinct factors of production rather than value added, if you look at this with a theoretical perspective, you want to look at factors of production and the earnings of the factors of production, including scarcity rents, when you're fortunate enough to have high quality factors of production. Meso-level models, and here I want to point out that, first of all, you do an analysis of scenarios of the future, and I was really pleased to see that because so much input-output analysis is of the past, and I think that until recently, researchers have not made a sharp enough conceptual distinction between analyzing the past and analyzing scenarios about the future. And one can make it look as if they use similar techniques, but they really don't. I mean, the future and the past are rather different in so many ways that it's not surprising that one should need different kinds of techniques. So I was very pleased to see that. But I want to point out that X equals I minus A inverse, or even a square matrix, or the inverse of a square matrix, is not the whole story of input-output economics. Input-output economics is economics at the meso level, with all that that entails, and there's no way that one matrix and one inverse and one mathematical expression can possibly help us look at all the questions we want to look at. And so I think it's a matter of just being convinced that one should be free to create a new model that helps to deal with the questions at hand. My colleagues and I have been using linear programs, which give, and I've met some people here today who are also, I was very pleased to do so. They have the advantage of allowing for an objective, and one could have more than one objective, or one could trade off objectives, and constraints. And there's a quantity primal and a price dual. And Jeff talked about mixed units. I don't know if it's obvious, but to me that means that different goods and services, and especially different factors of production, should be measured in whatever unit is natural for that particular object. And so labor in terms of person years is obvious, but water, fresh water in terms of cubic meters, and land of different qualities in terms of square kilometers, not everything in money values. Okay, so the linear programs have served us very well, and there's a literature on that for anyone who might be interested. The rectangular choice of technology model is another one that I think could be very suitable to your analysis looking at different technologies, and as the name implies, it's a rectangular matrix, not square, so you can't invert it even if you really wanted to, but you can solve it, and it gives you new kinds of flexibilities. And then models of the world economy, because ultimately we're talking about, you all have been talking about the insertion of Mexico within the global economy in a way that's advantageous to development of the economy. So at least conceptually, one has to think of it in the context of the world economy. And now that there are several models of the world economy partnering up either with us or with some of the other groups that have models of the world economy, and replacing what we have for Mexico with something better seems as if it would be worthwhile. When no data exists, no compiled data, so you'd really like to do some of these things and to use mixed units, but the data don't exist in mixed units. Or you really would like not to use the Canadian data as alternatives for forestry or for oil exploitation, but there are no data. Well, that's, from all the years that I've been observing how the researchers, how the analysts and the data compilers interact, it really is a two-way interaction. And the researchers say, we need these data, and it may take a long time, but finally the data compilers say, oh, there are several groups of researchers who all need those data. Maybe we should think about it. But I think that in order to demonstrate the data that you need, you've got to be bold and make estimates of the data and use your estimates so that somebody could say, those data they could be improved. Why don't we ask the statistical office, in INEGI in this case, if they could, evaluate them and perhaps come up with better data along those lines. But along those lines, detailed sector studies based on the specialized literatures are a good way to begin. And that's how my colleagues and I began doing this kind of work, is just reading lots of engineering journals about the alternative technologies for making steel from recycled raw material rather than from virgin raw material, and start from the same vector and change coefficients. We don't deal with flows, we deal with coefficients, inputs per unit of output. So we made our own estimates. Okay, but better yet, and I think that now in the 21st century, it has come to maturation, is the prospect for interdisciplinary collaboration, and increasingly of economists with experts in energy, in water, in forestry, where one says to them, here is the column of coefficients of inputs per unit of output that we have. And they'd rather that it not be in money values, by the way. So does this make sense to you? And so that may take weeks, it may even take a few months to talk about what it means and if it makes sense. And once it does, then you say, how might it be different in the future? Could you give us 3 different columns of coefficients, and coefficients not only of intermediate inputs, but also of factors of production, not value added, but factors of production? Could you give us 3 different alternatives for input vectors for how forestry might be carried out in the future in this country that would have both potential economic advantages, link up more with other production sectors in the country, and be environmentally useful, and then you've got much better data than using the Canadian data to use. And so I think the bottom line is that the data work should be a collaboration with the statistical office, but you've got to, the analyst has to take the initiative when it's new data that are not available yet to show why it's important to have them and to just get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faye. Apart from being interesting, clear, and provocative, the three presentations have adjusted to the time that we have allocated to them. So we have enough time to open up to questions and answers and to leave the final minutes so that if the participants want to, the presenters and the commentators want to respond to those questions and commentaries, they have the time to do so. Roberto Cabral? Hello. Yes, Roberto Cabral from the Faculty of Economics. More than a question, I want to make a very brief commentary to locate the real value of the work that was done on climate change and import-output in Mexico, which is a value that is much higher than the one that Pablo recognizes. The fact that in Mexico there haven't been matrices for more than 2 decades was not a technical issue or a lack of institutional capacity to develop matrices. It was a political decision, a decision of policy. Because most of the economists that had ruled the country and that have an influence on the economic policies, the matrix of input-output were not a relevant instrument. When we set forth to carry out an analysis of this sort for climate change, it was because we were looking for a multidisciplinary vision and a multi-focused approach on climate change in Mexico. In the past, just like the international discussion between Stern and Nordhaus, where it was either general balance or nothing but general balance to analyze climate change. And we took a different decision here. There was a decision to see models of general balance, economic metrics, and of course also input-output matrices. And that's the value of this work, is to revalue the input-output analysis matrix as an instrument of political policy, as an instrument to design public policies. And this work, I used to work in the government and now in the government, but and now at the university, but this was of great use to us, this paper. What Dr. Hewings and Dr. Duchin said, I'm responding to that because this is work of a group of researchers that worked on econometric projections, input-output, to have an overall information. So all that information is available to you, has been published, but I would insist for policy in terms of climate change, the importance of this is to revalue the input-output matrix in a discussion context where the economists devoted to climate change in Mexico didn't even know the input-output matrix. It's not that they discarded it, they didn't even take it into account because they didn't know it. So this is a piece of work that will continue having a lot of importance in this country, and there's still a lot more to be done. Everything that has been pointed out here, I think, will allow us to have a richer instrument with this input-output approach. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for both the presentation and for the interesting discussions from the three people who've discussed. I think they've all added to a very helpful understanding of the way input-output can be used to develop environmental policy. Just to say a few things from my own background and experience in this. Of course, Pablo is looking, as he says, just at one aspect of greenhouse gas reduction on the supply side, and indeed on just one instrument, i.e. regulation, and regulation of a particular kind, i.e. imposing targets taken from Canadian experience of the possibility of the technology and applying them to the similar Mexican industries. And I think this is very helpful in showing just what the scale of what can be done. And of course your conclusion, which I wholly agree with, is that that would not be nearly enough, and the growth rate would continue. What I would add to that is, of course, Canadian technologies are also going to be developed over that period, so that's going to change. Other countries might have better technologies in particular areas, but I think most important, the regulations and how they're imposed in Mexico depend on Mexican institutions and the way government interacts with industries and localities in enforcing those regulations. And of course, these are quite different from Canadian experience. It's just a different culture. And I think what that leads me to say is that this is your approach is excellent in identifying the strategic sectors, and so then linking in with government approaches to these sectors and to the differences between them, because some can be more easily regulated than others because of concentrations. The government can experiment with the sort of things that are done in Canada or the sort of things in the United Kingdom, where there are voluntary agreements to reduce emissions, but at the same time, these are backed up with some kind of tax system or regulation system which will penalize those who don't achieve it. And what we found in analyzing the UK climate change agreements was that they did achieve quite a lot, even by the announcement effect, even before they came into force, by encouraging the industries to look at new ways of doing things. And looking to the way forward, and I think this is the beginning of a research program. Of course, if the next stage, to my mind, is to link the input-output model with price-sensitive demand, both within industry, particularly for electricity production and use of different fossil fuels and renewables, and in other industries which do have opportunities for substituting different lower carbon inputs. And I think that may link in with the US EPA's looking at the electricity sector and how it might reduce CO2 emissions from electricity via emission trading schemes. And so Mexico may have the opportunity for emission trading schemes, and they have the advantage of raising revenues, which then can help to incentivize technological change in both in the electricity supply and in other parts of the economy. And I think, just to conclude, there's two extra things which I think are very important. And one is reductions in greenhouse gases also reduce local air pollution. And that's a big problem for Mexico and very well worth having some kind of link in there. And secondly, the issues of what's it all for, which is to do with economic development, but that in turn is linked to local employment and equality issues in Mexico. And it seems to me that Mexico has great opportunities for, in the forestry sector, of developing forestry and agriculture, in developing land-based, low greenhouse gas emission products, reforestry, afforestry, and biomass, which could give great opportunities for local employment and research and development, exploiting Mexico's advantages.
Pablo, thanks for a very interesting presentation, which started some thinking on my part. There's one strategic element I think I do not agree with, and that is your choice of key sectors. First at a technical level, and second at a conceptual level. At the technical level, you use Rasmussen for forward linkages. And that actually is a row sum of the Leontief inverse, so that gives you the backward linkage of a unit factor of final demand. That's already known in the literature to be a very bad measure. Secondly, using hypothetical extractions tell you essentially that if you extract a big sector, that it will have a big impact. And if you extract a small sector, it will have a small impact. So that is not extremely useful. So those are two technical objections I have. But far more important, I think, is And there I'm less certain, so this is more a question to you. But should you not, if you correctly identify big forward and backward linkages and define that as key sectors, should you not then choose as strategic sectors for greenhouse gas policy the sectors with the smallest forward and backward linkages instead of the sectors with the biggest backward and forward linkages? And I think that hangs together with the fact what type of policy instruments are you employing. In most cases, the policy instruments will lead to some kind of cost increase for the sectors of which you are trying to lower the pollution levels. Now you would, that's okay, but then you would want that to be the sectors with the smallest impact on the rest of the economy. So would you not strategically choose the sectors with the smallest linkages and the highest polluters? So that's the opposite. Or do I see something wrong there?
¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Comentario? Sí.
Thank you, Pablo. It was a very interesting paper. I would like to add some minor comments to the commentators. I think actually both commentators stressed the importance of the choice of the correct model. And I think they are completely right. Let's consider the following. If the technology is changed in order to prevent from too much greenhouse gases, technical coefficients are changed, the price system will be changed. If the price system will be changed, then this has an impact of the choice of technique. So there will be some substitution effects. There will be changes in demand, and so on and so on. All that could be eventually covered by a CGE model. So now I'm not in favor of CGE models, as you know. The next step, what happens after that, cannot be implemented by a CGE model, because a CGE model assumes that all factors are currently fully employed. Now, what will happen actually is that the production activity of Mexico will go down, consumption will be reduced, employment will be reduced, and we will and we have a reduction in the economic activity. And the next question, what shall be addressed, I think you mentioned that, Jeff, is who bears the burden? Is it consumers or producers? Is it workers or capitalists? Yeah? And that requires a far more flexible model than a CGE model can be.
We have time for a last question. Very good. So, there are no more questions then, is there other? So, Pablo, whether you would like to respond? Well, the truth is that the questions that have been posed, or the observations that have been made, have to do with the quality of the people that that ask the questions, and I'm afraid I'm not at that level. Geoffrey, Faye, Terry, Jan Osterhaben, and even Kristen Lager have made very important contributions in the input-output analysis. Here, in this case, specifically, the first checklist that Geoffrey gave me was that. It was a checklist. I'm going to work on the model because, in fact, everything that he says is missing. I recognize that, and I have no observation to make about this. In the case of the comments made by Faye, it seems to me very important to underline that we have here at the university a team, a group, a working group on input-output that has been working for a very short time. It was created a very short time ago, and those of us that lead this working group, or task force, they are actually, because I do not consider myself to be at the same level, is Dr. Martin Huchet, Mr. Valentin Solis, and myself, who have helped create this analysis. It's a structural analysis group that did not used to exist in the National Autonomous University. And to conclude, it didn't exist anywhere in this scope with these possibilities. The work that the MIP, the Mexican Input-Output Association, has done is very important, but it's very recent, and we congratulate ourselves because it has placed an emphasis on this work. However, this very small team that we have, that is not that small actually, it's a real novelty in our country, and based on this team that we have created, works have been produced that are not the responsibility of one individual, but of a broad working team. Many of them are present here, and some of them have joined, others have left, but all this group is still a group in formation. And I'm saying this because all the comments that have been made are not only to benefit me, for me to expand the model, but these comments, I think, are of use to all the colleagues here, because a penny has dropped that we still have to work a little bit more in order to be able to show off that we have actually solved the problem. One of the key points is that, in fact, we do not, at least I didn't do a piece of work approaching the demand issue. This is a weakness in the analysis, and not only in itself, but it's also a weak point in the projection. The projection that I'm making is a projection that is quite limited, so to speak. It has a lot of constraints. And one of them is that we do not analyze the demand, neither by sector nor by institutional demand sector, i.e., we are assuming that demand remains with the same structure in the forward linkage. However, I do defend the point that we have been able to locate, although not with the precision that Jan Osterhaben is demanding from me, but we have been able to identify the sectors that for Mexico are of key importance and at the same time are large-scale emitters. And it's very simple. It's the energy sectors, including electricity, oil, and derived products, and with all that implies, and transport. And that's it. That's enough. If we manage to change technology in these sectors, we will solve the climate change issue. Now, this does not exclude, and I want to say this frankly, that other kind of measurements and other public policy measures can be applied, such as taxation, here, there, and on the demand, such as increasing the price of gasoline. It doesn't exclude what I say and what I have set forth, that the result, for example, the client was Semarnat, a ministry of environment. And I told them very clearly that the advantage is that the oil industry still belongs to the state and the electric power industry continues being in the hands of the state. And that helps us a lot to apply strong measures that are well oriented. It was not the case in Canada. In fact, you're right. In that sector, they failed, because these were measures that they couldn't force the private companies to enforce or to go into action based on these measures. In our case, we have the advantage that they're state-owned. Transport, it's not the case because most of the transport is private. But I have seen it in places like Chicago, where they have decided to put an end to pollution in the city, and they took the decision that all the taxis from one day to the other had to be electric, and they did that. And they decided that public transport was hybrid, and they did that. They were able to do that. They managed to go beyond, as Obama says. They went beyond. Yes, we can, as Obama says. Yes, we could. Yes. Thank you very much. Yes, we were able to, actually, rather than yes, we could.